Our next speaker for this morning is Vishal Ganesan, who will give an overview of the history of the genesis and manifestations of Hinduphobia on American soil. Vishal Ganesan is an attorney, media commentator, and the curator of Hindu History Project, which is dedicated to understanding how Americans conceived of the Hindu in the 19th and 20th centuries. By focusing primarily on newspaper clippings, Hindu history aims to describe and contextualize how the average American's attitudes towards the Hindu have changed over time. Hindu History is a multimedia project that exists on multiple digital platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, Substack. In addition to his archival research, Vishal has also discussed his work on podcasts such as Bharat Varta and Indus Think. Vishalji's presentation for our conference is entitled Unearthing the Story of the Hindu in America's Newspaper. This presentation presents unique archival research curated by Vishalji through the Hindu History Initiative. It's sure to be an eye-opening and stimulating presentation, so please let's give a big, warm welcome to Vishal Ganesan.
Hi, can you guys hear me? All right, I'm going to screen share, so just let me know. Here we go. All right, perfect. Okay, so I guess I'll just tell you when to go to the next slide, and we can go from there. I made a couple of last-minute updates that won't be reflected in this version, but it's okay, nothing too important. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm really honored to be a part of this conference and among such esteemed company. I feel pretty underqualified, but hopefully hopefully you guys find the presentation interesting and the materials helpful. All right, let's go to the first slide. So I just wanted to start with, this is the most common question I get to this day, which is why Hindu with the two O's. And the distinction here is that Hindu, the kind of obvious answer is just that this is how it's spelled in a lot of the early American newspapers and also the early colonial literature, right? They just this is how it was rendered with the two O's. And I thought it was a good kind of term to use because the Hindu history is not really about Hindus or Hinduism per se. It's about this construct of the Hindu, right? I mean, a lot of these newspaper clips that I'll be sharing and a lot of the stories, these were formed in America before Hindus or Indians were in America in any significant numbers, right? Indian immigration to America really only started in earnest in the early 20th century in the form of manual labor, especially on the West Coast. But these newspaper clips date to the late 18th century, although there were certainly, some scattered populations of Indian Americans, Hindu Americans, they weren't really part of the cultural consciousness in the way that we are now. So the Hindu is a construct, and it's formed from an amalgamation of these different sources, including missionary journals, material goods, and the newspaper clips that I like to share. And on this point, I think I'm highly indebted to the book of Professor Altman. He wrote this book, Heathen Hindu, and he makes this methodological distinction that I think is very helpful, which is that the question is, how did Hindus become conceivable in America? And that's really what I'm trying to kind of dig into and look into. So that's why it's the Hindu with two O's. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to start with this picture. This is the East India Marine Society. So this was founded in 1799 by a group of New England merchants who were trading with India. America's commercial relationship goes back a long time, even before this, before America was an independent country. Obviously, Yale was founded by, an East India Company officer who famously made his fortune, through nefarious means in South India, and he ended up founding that university. But the point is that, this is the commercial relationship that India had with America was always kind of one of the prominent threads, I would say, of the history of Hindu history. And I was reading, so Rajendra Kaur and Anupama Arora, they're two scholars in America, and they have this collection of essays that's very interesting called the India and the American Imaginary. And they talk about how this early commercial relationship was not only profitable for both Indians and Americans, but it was also mutually respectful. Like there was a lot of history of gift giving between groups. American merchants relied extensively on Indian intermediaries to kind of get a hold of the local market and to engage in commerce. And this led to a lot of personal relationships between different parties. And there's a great anecdote of a bunch of American merchants gifted this Parsi merchant, or no, sorry, they gifted Ramdulal Day this life-size portrait of George Washington in 1801. And then a Parsi merchant, Nusarwanji Wadia, returned the favor in 1803 by gifting these American merchants a portrait of himself. So I think we all know who got the better end of that deal. But yeah, it is kind of an interesting sort of thread to kind of trace through American history, this commercial relationship. And, as we'll see in the coming slides, and Cora and Aurora point this out, this was kind of in stark contrast to the relationship that we see form on the basis of kind of missionary activity, which is really kind of the basis of Hindu history. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this guy is Claudius Buchanan. He's a key figure in the Hindu history story. He was an Anglican missionary who was active in India. And a lot of the earliest writings we have are from Claudius Buchanan. I think that the Juggernaut, right? This is like a story that is relatively commonly known, at least among people who are kind of in this world. Juggernaut was an anglicized rendition of Jagannath, right? Jagannath Yatra in Orissa. And Claudius Buchanan was the first person to really write about this event, and he was a very vivid writer. And I've included a quote here from Michael Altman, and kind of summarizing how he characterized the Jagannath Yatra. And it was bloody, violent, superstitious, and backward. And right above that, this is an ad from the early. I left out the newspaper citation here, but this is like an early ad from the 19th century, and this is you can see the title of his book here, The Christian Researchers in Asia. This was a book written by Claudius Buchanan that included not only his characterization of the Juggernaut, but also a bunch of other kind of narratives of his travels in India, and it was hugely influential in America. I mean, it was published extensively, and excerpts of it were also published in missionary journals throughout the Northeast in particular. That's kind of one of the other background issues here, right? Is that there was a whole sort of information ecosystem where you had a lot of missionaries operating in India. They published in these missionary journals. One of the first was called the Panoplist. And then these missionary journals would kind of publish these accounts that were subsequently picked up by newspapers. And so you had this sort of flow of information that would help disseminate this stuff to the average American reader. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is just an excerpt from Michael Altman's book, and just another clip. This is from 1937, so quite a bit later. But I wanted to include a later clip because I wanted to emphasize just how important this juggernaut image was. I mean, it really was like, it was so vividly described by Buchanan. And the other reason why I think it was so persistent in the American imagination was, if you look at the description that I've included here from Professor Altman. So when Claudius Buchanan was describing the juggernaut for American audiences, I mean, America was, and to some extent still is, a very Christian country, and he used very explicitly Christian terminology. So, juggernaut was described as it's like the seat of Moloch. You can just read the excerpt here, right? Buchanan also described juggernaut in biblical terms for his evangelical audience. Juggernaut was, quote, the chief seat of Moloch on the whole earth, referencing the god whose worship was forbidden in Leviticus. And then Buchanan saw the place of the skulls called Golgotha, a reference to the place of Jesus' crucifixion in the New Testament. So there was a kind of a deliberate, it was a deliberate choice by Claudius Buchanan to describe the juggernaut in a way that would elicit kind of shock and horror among an American audience who was familiar with obviously biblical lore and Old Testament and New Testament. And so for this reason, I think it became such a very dominant image in the American imagination. Not to mention, Buchanan included these accounts of mass human sacrifice, like people throwing themselves under the wheels of the juggernaut, which obviously not just for American audiences, but for any audiences that were pretty terrifying to hear. Of course, these were fabrications. Like there was no human sacrifice or anything that was part of this yatra, but it he had a captive audience, let's say. So it was kind of easy just to pass off these misrepresentations, and they took hold quite quickly. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so these are just another a collection of clips. I mentioned the kind of commerce and this mercantile relationship. This was, one of the first threads to emerge in the kind of relationship between America and the Hindu. A lot of that material culture featured was featured prominently in the American imagination for people who saw it. Like these merchants were bringing back textiles, they were bringing back religious iconography. Actually, if you're in Massachusetts, a lot of that material is still in the Peabody Essex Museum. You can still go there and see it. It's one of the oldest collections in America, I think. But yeah, the Claudius Buchanan, I also somewhat facetiously call this the Temple of Doom thread, but this was kind of the second prominent thread, right? This kind of the horrors of India narrative that you see early on in Claudius Buchanan's writing and is subsequently reproduced in newspapers. So I wanted to include some clips here that were just kind of illustrative of this thread. So the left and middle clips here are excerpts from a speech delivered to the Baptist Missionary Society by a Major General Prolo, who I believe was a British soldier who was stationed in India. And they were published in the Alexandria Gazette in 1816. And then the clip on the right is from an article titled "The Ignorance of the Hindus," published in the Alexandria Herald in 1822. And what you see here is you see like a kind of a reproduction of a lot of the earlier material that we saw propagated by Buchanan and his ilk. So for example, if you look at the middle clip, you see he beholds the avenues of the temple. This is the Jagannath temple strewed with skulls and human bones. You see in the Ignorance of the Hindus article, you see extensive descriptions of female infanticide, which was another kind of major theme in the early writings from the Buchanan school, especially like women throwing their female children into rivers. This was another kind of recurring motif. So yeah, I mean these kind of descriptions featured very prominently in these early descriptions of Hindu religious practice and proved to be pretty persistent and influential. And I think I'm pretty sure that the organizers of the conference are uploading all these materials. And if you want to read them more fully, you can just go to my Twitter account. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is another one, kind of in the same, in the same thread, I would say, this kind of a Temple of Doom, Claudius Buchanan thread of Hindu history. And this is the article is The Necessity of Christianity to India. This was published in the Portland Gazette in 1821. And the other thing, I mean, I should just note about the kind of newspaper, this is actually a good opportunity, I guess, for a little methodological diversion. So, like why newspapers, right? One of the things, the way this started was, I basically used the Library of Congress newspaper archive, and it started out as just like a procrastination thing at work. I just go on there and I kind of look up random old newspapers to see what I could find. And then I started finding more and more articles related to India and Hinduism, and that's kind of how this started. Where I was like, oh, maybe I'll just start collecting clips, that fall into this bucket. And so I started collecting all these newspaper clips, and but I didn't really know what to do with them, because I kind of had the vague idea that newspaper clips, as opposed to, let's say, scholarly works, give you a more accurate sense of what the average American thought. I think that's a fair assessment, because newspapers, especially during this period of American history, were so prolific. I mean, you had newspapers that were published in cities, you had regional newspapers, you had national newspapers. And a lot of these newspapers published multiple times a day. You'd have a morning edition, a noon edition, and an evening edition. So these papers were like in a constant dialogue with their audiences, and it makes for like a very vivid image of what was going on at the time, what people believed, and also, it's almost like an ongoing serial, because you see characters emerge over and over again, and you kind of see how they develop over time. And so, an article like this, right, like. This is published in the Portland Gazette in 1821, but that's just the clip I chose. I mean, these articles are often reproduced extensively nationally. So you'll find like the same article in newspapers all over the country. But this was actually one way in which Dr. Altman's book was so important, because, he reading that book kind of gave me an intellectual framework to fit all these newspaper clips in. But that's just a slight digression. So back to the article. Again, this is just to emphasize, I mean, you can see the kind of the continuation of these themes. The quote here: "Infanticide has been practiced in India from time immemorial. The Rajputs, a considerable tribe of Hindus, put all of their female children to death as soon as they are born. Not one survives." So, like obviously a lot of exaggeration here. So many Hindu females after marriage make a vow to offer their deity to the first child. And these children of the vow are drowned in this is a Brahmaputra, but Brahmaputra is the way they write it, and other sacred rivers. And then again, you see this kind of reproduction of the Hindu writings encourage persons afflicted with incurable distemper to drown themselves in some sacred river, or to throw themselves under the wheels of the car of the Jagannath. or to cast themselves into fire prepared by their relatives. Multitudes annually perish by these means. Yeah. So again, these ideas of Hindu religious practice, they became embedded in the American cultural imagination very early. And one of the reasons why, and obviously, it's not like people were traveling to India regularly then, and it wasn't like there were Indians coming to America to rebut these stereotypes or these myths. So there was really no other sources of information, right? So people kind of just saw this and they believed it because it also was in accordance with their kind of religious background and their education. So they had no real reason to doubt the veracity of these reports, and they were kind of reproduced freely and openly. And then if you see this last quote, surely they need Christianity who have no better God than Jagannath, i.e. the stump of a tree, no better savior than the Ganges, no other expectation in death than the transmigration into the body of some reptile. So, there's one of the kind of lessons of Hindu history that I'll revisit from time to time. And I think one of the lessons is, the kind of knowledge that was produced about Hindus in America and about India was always tied to, some interest groups, right? I mean, like, for example, for the kind of Claudius Buchanan school, like, it's pretty clear that there was a motivation here, right? And what is the motivation? Well, these churches were running pretty extensive missionary activities in India, and they needed to raise funds for that. And the one way to raise funds for it was to kind of propagate this information about what was going on in India to elicit horror and sympathy from the audience, right? So, one of the reasons why they focus so much on the sacrifice of female children is because this is, Americans are very generous people, and they would read these accounts of, Hindus throwing their female children into rivers and burning them in pyres, and then they would be motivated to donate money to these the churches and these conversion activities. So there's kind of, and so you have to, it's kind of important. It's interesting and important to kind of understand how these interest groups and how these kind of economic concerns are tied to knowledge production and the kind of views that are propagated by different groups in America at this time. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we've covered, or at least given you a little introduction. Again, like, this is not a comprehensive story by any means. It's Hindu history is a work in progress, but I'm trying to. My goal is trying to give you a framework to think about Hindu history in broader terms, and then you can take the evidence as it emerges and kind of fit it into your own model. So, I started out by explaining the kind of mercantile relationship, the commercial relationship. That's very important. And then you have this Claudius Buchanan thread, the Temple of Doom thread, which is very important. And then there's a third, right, which is the kind of elite philosophical scholarly thread. So I think it's important to, the intellectual background here, the history here is important. The comparative religion during this time in 18th century, 19th century America was very much steeped in Enlightenment thought, right? And what is Enlightenment views of religion? Well, one way to think about it is that this was the first time that religion was thought about as an abstract category, right? Like, before this, you had Christianity, you had Catholicism, you had Islam, you have different religions, but you didn't have that much thinking about what religion was as an abstract category. But during the Enlightenment, this changes because you start having, like, obviously in the aftermath of the Reformation, you have all these denominations come up, and you have people trying to negotiate differences between denominations. And then you also have the age of colonization, and all of a sudden Europeans are being exposed to the kind of religions of all these other different peoples, right? Or even if you don't want, if you want to use it from religions, they're being exposed to the spiritual thought, this kind of conceptions of divine in a bunch of different other cultures. And so this kind of led to this intellectual project of trying to systematize and categorize all these different systems into this abstract category of religion. So I've included a quote here by David Palin, who identified two principles. The first of these principles is that the religious faith is fundamentally an assent to certain truth. And the second is that these truths can be determined to be such by proper use of human reason. And so the person here, Hannah Adams, is very much in this tradition. So Hannah Adams was, she was a Unitarian. She was a scholar of comparative religion. She's also known actually in America as the first woman to really make a living in American history from writing. I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of her popular reputation. but she's very interesting, very impressive individual. She wrote this book called the Compendium of the Various Sects. This was originally published in 1784, with a bunch of subsequent editions that were kind of updated to reflect, new understanding. I mean, the Asiatic Society was published in, or the Asiatic Society in Bengal by William Jones. I think was founded in 1784 as well. I could have the date wrong, but this was a watershed moment, because you started getting Sanskrit texts and translations in America and in Europe, and those texts made it over to across the pond, and scholars like Hannah Adams, and not just Hannah Adams, but even like founding fathers like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were also interested in this. They were committed deists, which is like a kind of a very much a product of the Enlightenment view of religion. But Hannah Adams is very interesting because she was writing this book about trying to kind of categorize all these different religions. And she included the first kind of mention of the Hindu religious texts. And the other interesting point that we need to mention about Hannah Adams is that she is the progenitor of this declension theory. So, for these early scholars of comparative religion, even though they were genuinely curious about the Hindu religious texts, they were approaching this from the point of view of like Protestant Christianity as the one true religion, right? It's the best, and everything else is kind of judged according to those metrics. And so when she was studying these, the early Vedas, or whatever texts that she had access to in these early days of the Asiatic Society, she basically saw in those texts a spiritual conception of the divine that was in accordance with her, beliefs as a Unitarian to some extent. But then, on the other hand, she, like other Americans, were reading all these missionary reports published by the Panoplists in newspapers about, barbaric heathens and child sacrifice, human sacrifice. And so, she created this framework called she didn't call it this, but this is what we now call it, is declension theory, right? Which is the idea that the Hindus at some point had something approximating true religion. And then over time, it's been degenerated into this, polytheistic, idolatrous, heathen religion. And this framework features quite prominently, across the kind of scholarly understanding of Hinduism. But Hannah Adams, important figure, very early figure in Hindu history. Let's go to the next slide. So this is another guy, Joseph Priestley. He was actually a chemist, but also, I guess moonlighted as a comparative religion scholar. And like Hannah Adams, he was very interested in Hindu religious texts. And he was also a Unitarian, kind of a recurring motif. Unitarians were very interested in this stuff. And I've included some excerpts from his book here. This is a comparison of the institutions of Moses with those of the Hindus and other ancient nations. This was published in 1799, so a little bit after Hannah Adams. But this is actually John Adams' personal copy of the book. So you can see John Adams' annotations. And his annotations, I have to say, not that impressive. I expected better from John Adams, but we'll let that lie. But anyways, you can see his annotations in here, which I thought is kind of eye-opening for me. Like the extent to which John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were interested in this stuff. Not really something I expected. But the point is that this scholarly interest in Hinduism stretches back very early in American history. And Joseph Priestley, I mean, I've read through this book. I haven't read all of it, but it's kind of interesting because you can kind of sense a begrudging respect, because he acknowledged. So the context of this book was that there was a French Orientalist at this time, I'm forgetting his name, who basically argued that the Vedas were the origins of all like religious. He basically said the Vedas were the oldest religious text, and like all the biblical theology we have is derivative of it. So Priestley actually wrote his book to rebut that. And he actually begrudgingly accepts that the Vedas and Vedic mythology is older than the biblical tradition. But then he has this he distinguishes it by saying that the Hindus don't have divine revelation, and that's really what distinguishes them from the Christians or the Judeo-Christian tradition. But it's the takeaway here is that this elite intellectual interest goes back very far, and concentrated among New England Unitarians. All right, let's go to the next one. So this is we've covered kind of the three main threads, right? You have this commercial thread, you have the Claudius Buchanan thread, you have the elite thread, and it's not just this wasn't just like an isolated thing, right? Like this was the American interest in the Hindu, the American construct of the Hindu was an important part of American society. And to that end, I wanted to include these images, which aren't from newspapers, but actually from school textbooks. So this is from a textbook called Mitchell's System of Modern Geography. It was one of the most widely published textbooks in American schools in the 19th century. And you see here the same kind of Enlightenment preoccupation with categorization and systemization. So you see they this is the image on the left is a the image on the left is a they're trying to categorize basically all the different cultures. So you have the enlightened and civilized, which obviously is like the Western European, half civilized, which includes Indians. Then you have savage and barbarous, and this is the kind of paradigm they use to discuss all these different cultures and all these different civilizations. But the interesting thing, for our purposes, is the treatment of the Hindu in these textbooks. So if you look at these two clips here, these are specifically where they talk about religion, right? So Hindus are included in this bigger umbrella category of pagans or heathens. So this is from the geography textbook. Who are the pagans or heathens? Pagans are those who believe in false gods and worship idols. Idols are either living cultures as beasts, birds, and reptiles, or images made of wood, stone, metals, or the sun and other heavenly bodies. And then you have a continuation of these sort of the anthropological observations about the Hindu, including if you look at number 11 here, you have the Hindus are divided into 4 castes or classes. The Brahmins are priests, soldiers, merchants, and farmers. Sudras are laborers. These castes are forbidden to intermarry or even to eat or drink together, and the children belong to the same class as their parents. And then number 12 here, you see Brahmanism is the religion of nearly all the Hindus. It is a system of idolatry replete with superstition and cruelty. So, so this is the material. The question is, why is it there? And here, Professor Altman, I think, has a very interesting insight. And what he says is that this kind of formulation of school textbooks during this period, the categorization of different civilizations, depending on their quote unquote stage of evolution, was meant to emphasize the superiority of American culture, religion, and values. And when it came to religion specifically, this was meant to create a contrast in the student's mind, right? That, America was great because it was Protestant, and America was democratic because it was Protestant. And on the other hand, like if and India and Hindus formed a natural foil to that. So India was half civilized and Hindus were half civilized because they didn't have Christianity, because they were Hindu, and pagan religions were inextricably tied with this very hierarchical discriminatory system. So as Altman says here, Hindu religion led to a hierarchical caste system, while Protestant Christianity brought egalitarian democracy. So the point is that the construct of the Hindu, as treated in these geography textbooks at the time, were an integral part of identity formation for American students, and India was useful as a foil in that respect. So yeah, this is this is just the one textbook I chose because it was happens to be one of the more popular ones, but there were other textbooks during this period too. And Dr. Altman talks about it more extensively in his book, if that's something you're curious about. Next slide, please. So this is another a prominent writer and character that I wanted to introduce from this period. His name is Frank Carpenter. So Frank Carpenter was one of the most notable travel writers from this period in the 20th century. I mean, he was published very extensively. Not only was he publishing in newspapers all over the country, but he also wrote these little geography kits that were used in schools. So the article here was published in the National Tribune in 1889. Yeah, so as you can see in the caption here, he published these Carpenter's Geographic Readers, which were standard texts in American schools, used as standard text for 40 years. And he traveled extensively. I think he even when he died, he was like in China on an international trip. But he made several trips to India and wrote numerous travelogues about his trips to Benares in particular. And the clip above, this is his description of the Kashi Vishwanath temple. And the quote I've included here is, quote, "It is vile, but a priest sits upon its well curb and sells its water to worshippers by the cupful. Filthy as it is, they drink it and pray as they do so. In all of Siam, Thailand, that's Thailand, China, Korea, and Japan, I have not seen idolatry so repulsive as it is in India. The gods of the Hindus represent the worst rather than the best elements of humanity, and they are gods of destruction rather than creation. The people themselves, notwithstanding their daily baths in the Ganges, are dirty, and their temples are worse than unkempt barnyards. The standard of morality of the people is low, and the missionaries have a field here before them through which energy and money run through water like a sieve." So, I mean, this was 1889. So, quite a bit later than the early Claudius Buchanan clips that we saw and we shared earlier. But you can see how the kind of same motifs are reproduce themselves, right? And Carpenter, I mean, he, was considered very credible. He was like the world traveler. He published extensively. And he has a bunch of articles like this. So I've shared on the Twitter account and the Instagram account. And so I encourage you to go check these out. But yeah, Frank Carpenter, also an interesting figure in Hindu history that I wanted to share with you guys. Let's go to the next slide. So this is another kind of striking image. I was in correspondence with Dr. Altman, and he said that this is the image that actually motivated him to write his book. And when I saw it, I was also kind of taken aback. But this is a Thomas Nast book, a comic, Thomas Nast of Condé Nast fame. It was published in 1871 in Harper's Weekly. And what it illustrates is how closely tied in early American attitudes to the Hindu were with the prevailing anti-Catholic prejudice in America. So, let's unpack this image a little bit. So if you look at the bottom, you see that the river is labeled the American River Ganges, which is like, that's already like, what is going on here? And then in the background, that building is the Vatican. And then in the middle ground, you have a US public school that's kind of crumbling. And then you have this Protestant pastor who's kind of guarding some kids. And then out of the river, it's kind of hard to tell, but what they are, they're like bishops, they're Catholic bishops, but like they're kind of reptilian in their garb. I guess they're supposed to look like crocodiles. So you have a lot going on in this image, right? An amalgamation of images. So you have this American River Ganges, you have this Catholic imagery, you have this Protestant pastor, what's going on? And the idea was that, Americans at this time were very worried about Catholic influence in their public institutions, whether political institutions or public schools. And, for a lot of Protestants during this time, Catholicism was considered basically another form of polytheism, right, of heathenism. And so in a sort of roundabout way, the Hindu became a kind of useful cudgel for Protestants during this time, because the argument was that if we will allow Catholics to continue to gain influence in our public lives and our public institutions, we'll eventually become like the Hindus, which is where the Ganges comes from. And recall, this is in context of, a kind of well-trodden story or stereotype of Hindus sacrificing their children in these rivers, So, whereas the Ganges for practicing Hindus obviously evokes, feelings of sacredness and, positive feelings. For Americans during this time, the Indian rivers were, places of kind of horror and terror. So you can see how these images were combined in a way that not only reflect the information that we've seen so far, but reflect, the specific sociological and theological disputations that were going on in America at this time, which is kind of a key theme of Hindu history, right? Which is that the Hindu as a construct was always being wielded by different parties according to this, the battles they were fighting in America. So whether it was Unitarians fighting against Trinitarians or Protestants fighting against Catholics, it became kind of a useful tool to be used in that way, and that affects the way people see it. But yeah, this cartoon definitely one of the most striking finds from Hindu history, and I wanted to share it with you guys. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the new slides I added that didn't make it to this new version. So in the interim period, right, that comic was from 1871. What happens? Well, there's a watershed event in 1893, which is the World Parliament of Religions. So the World Parliament of Religions, I'm sure most of you are familiar, right? This was an event held in Chicago. And this is, if you were to ask me what the traditional narrative of Hinduism in America is, I would say that it starts in 1893, because this is when Swami Vivekananda comes to America and gives his speech and kind of becomes a sensation. And it's kind of it's a watershed moment, because after Vivekananda gives his speech, he travels America, gives all these lectures. And actually, I'll plug Dr. Jeffrey Long. His book, Hinduism in America, talks about this very extensively and very informatively. So I would recommend people read that book. But, Dr. Long mentions how when Vivekananda was going on this tour, the lectures were often sold out. They were very popular events. But there were also almost always protests outside the venue, because there were conservative Christians who were opposed to Vivekananda kind of spreading the gospel, as it were. But, in the aftermath of that World Parliament, you had this blossoming of Hindu spirituality in America. You had the Vedanta Society, and then you had a bunch of other monks and spiritual figures come to America. and start to gain adherence, especially among the upper class elite in American cities. So these are just a sample of newspaper clips that I've kind of wanted to show you guys just for the headlines in the early 20th century. And you see, these are kind of recurring motifs, right? Hindu priests invade America. American women are losing their fortunes and reasons and seeking the eternal youth offered by swarthy idol worshippers. One of my favorite Hindu history phrases. Some missionary myths. Yeah, so this is another thing, right? Hindu monk becomes a fad. Swami Ram is taken up. Swami Abhedananda, he was actually the head of the Vedanta Society in New York. He was a Ramakrishna mission monk who Swami Vivekananda personally brought to America to head up the Vedanta Society, and he was very popular. And then, so you also have, along with this kind of blossoming of Hindu spirituality, you have more people writing in American newspapers disputing the stereotypes that have become embedded in the American cultural imagination. So you have this Times article from 1900 where this, I believe, was Swami Ram writing this, where he says no crocodiles could live in the swift flowing waters of the Ganges, and other explanations of what he calls American mistakes. So you have this kind of a burgeoning attempt to kind of rebut some of the stereotypes that had been proliferating. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, and this is just kind of return to pick up the thread from our elite, understanding. Like you always had this kind of elite reception of a Hindu spiritual text, and they were much more sympathetic. Like I didn't even talk about the transcendentalists, but that was such a massive movement and for our purposes in the 19th century. But this continues, right? You have the transcendentalists, you have a lot of the theosophist movement, you have New Thought. So many different American spiritual movements in the 19th century are influenced by Hindu spirituality. And in the early 20th century, you see also the blossoming of ashrams, of theosophical retreats. So I just wanted to include these two pages to kind of show you guys, that not only were these popular, but like it was a subject of considerable public fascination and curiosity as well. So you have these long profiles of like life on an ashram. This one on the right, Karma Sat in the Land of Wood and Nutmegs. This was a Vedanta Society ashram in Connecticut, I believe. And these articles are quite wonderful to read, actually. Like there's definitely the sort of, you still see the sort of, the prejudice shines through, but it's they're from an anthropological perspective, a historical perspective. These articles are very interesting, and I talk about them in more detail on Hindu history. Let's go to the next one. So this is the kind of reaction, right? So one of the lessons of Hindu history is, you have these three threads that I try to trace, just by kind of looking at the newspaper articles. And it's very interesting to see how these threads interact, right? Like if you buy the hypothesis that I'm selling you, which is that, the kind of reception of the Hindu, the construct of the Hindu is a product of cultural and social forces, then, the knowledge production itself changes depending on the relation between those underlying social forces, right? So you have this blossoming of Hindu spirituality in the early 20th century. And then as you'd expect, you see a corresponding rise in the sort of Claudius Buchanan Temple of Doom school, right? So here are some prominent examples. So this essay on the left is something I've been excerpting extensively on the Twitter account, but it's from an essay written by Mabel Potter Daggett in 1911 called The Heathen Invasion of America. And here the title, American Women Losing Fortunes and Reason, Seeking the Eternal Youth, Promised by Swarthy Priests of the Far East. So again, this was a very common motif, right? Specifically American women, like they were, you have a lot of paranoia in American newspapers from this period about American women, going to yoga classes and losing their minds, right? Or like falling in with some Swami and leaving their husbands. These are very common articles during this time. And just to quote briefly, so yoga, this is from the Daggett essay. Eve is eating the apple again. It is offered as knowledge of the occult that will solve riddles of existence. Yoga, that Eastern philosophy, the emblem of which is the coiled serpent, is being widely disseminated here. And before a charm that seemingly they cannot resist, thousands of converts are yielding to temptation to embrace its teachings of strange mysteries. Literally, yoga means the path that leads to wisdom. Actually, it is proving the way that leads to domestic infelicity and insanity and death. They are priests from east of the Suez, who with soft-spoken proselytizing have whispered this mysticism into the ears of the American women. While the churches of America are spending $20 million annually in the cause of foreign missions, the pagans have executed an amazing flank movement. They have sent their emissaries to us. Today, the tinkling temple bells ring out with a derisive, jarring tone in a Christian land. So you see, this is this was written in Harper's, I believe, or Hampton's Weekly. It was written in Hampton's Weekly, but published extensively in newspapers. So like, I would just search Daggett in the newspaper archive, and you see, the excerpts published extensively. Interestingly, she also attributes the World Parliament as the kind of beginning of this cultural movement, which shouldn't surprise us. And then here's another article I love from the Daybook. This is have sorority girls fallen for a rumored Oriental cult. They arrested this poor Bengali student. There was no evidence even tying him to it, but they were like, oh, he must be responsible. But also, if you want to read that article in its entirety, it's on the Twitter account. I'll repost it after this. But yeah, I mean, the point is that you see a very distinct cultural reaction to the rise of popularity of yoga and Hindu spirituality in the early 20th century, and it centers around this concern about Hindu American women specifically. Next slide, please. Just a couple more articles. This one on the left is also from Daggett. I just wanted to share it because the illustration was quite striking. And also this quote I thought was very telling as well. The imported religions of the Orient that sow the seeds of subtle destruction are offered to the uninitiated as beautiful philosophies. So this is clearly a reference to Theosophy and Vedanta. On the surface, they are that, but they are inevitably sprung from the soil of paganism and are tinctured with its practices. And then this is just another article from a newspaper around this time about the cruel idols. Interestingly, Kali kind of takes the place of Juggernaut at this time because a lot of articles came out in the interim period of travelers who go to see the Juggernaut, and they realize that Claudius Buchanan was lying because they don't see any of the stuff that he was talking about. And that's one of the interesting things about the narrative switch here is that early on you see like the child sacrifice, Juggernaut, the cruelty, all this. It later becomes, when people start traveling there and that no longer becomes tenable to uphold that stereotype, they start saying it used to be really bad, but then the British stopped it from, the British, made it illegal. So now it's safe and all this. But yeah, just wanted to share this. This is from 1912. All right, next one. And this is just another one I wanted to share. This was a kind of a rather amusing comic from 1913 in the San Francisco Call, Swami Kohlrabi. So that one of the other parts of this reaction in the early 20th century is this a lot of derision targeted towards the figure of the Swami. So this comic was published in 1913, and it's actually just this random guy who like is in blackface or brownface pretending to be a Swami. And then he, as you see in this bottom slide, he basically tricks women out of their money. So he's like, it's a figure of, it reflects the kind of cultural turn at this point. And actually, Vivek Bald, I don't know if you read his book, Bengali Harlem. He has this great quote where he talks about during this period, the United States during this period as it was in the grips of a craze over India and the Orient that was larger and more pervasive than anything that had occurred since. But yeah, I also have this on the Twitter account if you want to see it. All right, next. And then this is just another wanted to share. This is kind of goes back to the commercial, or that's kind of the thread that I neglected. But I talk about this more on my Twitter account. But one of the other interesting things about the capitalist reception of the Hindu is that all this talk about like the superstitions and the fakirs with their magic powers and priests with their hypnotic abilities. It is an opportunity, and Americans always know an opportunity when they see one. And you start seeing a proliferation of Hindu wizards, right? People who know Hindu magic. So these are just some good examples of, I like this guy on the left, Rismore the Hindu. But they claim to have like gone to India and learned this magic, and then they make money selling it in America. Hindu magic takes America by storm. All right, next slide. And then here's just a couple more kind of related to the earlier Daggett point I was making earlier, just about yoga in particular causing some concern. But as you also see here on the left, I mean, you also see this commercialization of yoga emerge very early. This is actually like a little, I don't know what you want to call it. It's like an action figure or something called a yoga. And it's sold as a way to aid concentration for business purposes, which I thought was quite amusing. But yeah, here again, mysterious yoga faith of East India, which has robbed an American citizen of a devoted wife, kind of reflecting the paranoia I was talking about earlier. And this is the same excerpt from Daggett that I quoted from. All right, next. All right, that was the last slide. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you found that interesting. Again, I just included the kind of major takeaways here. I hope I was clear in the kind of narrative threads I was trying to share with you guys. And I think following these newspaper clips is an interesting way to see how they interact and how they intertwine. And if you want to know more, follow Hindu History on Twitter and Instagram. I'm also on Substack. Please subscribe. looking forward to following this journey more and seeing where it takes us. I'm still in the early 20th century, but I'm planning on just keep going and see what I find. So yeah, I don't know if we have time for questions or whether we need to move on, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, Vishal. I think I speak for all of our attendees when I say that seeing visual evidence of Hinduphobia in our country's media, historically tied to Hinduphobic tropes over such a long period of time, was really powerful. Thank you, Vishalji, for that amazing presentation.
For the latest on our YouTube channel, click subscribe and hit the bell icon for alerts on new content. Remember to like, comment, and share our videos. For more about HSC, you can visit the social media handles listed below.